Ladies and gentlemen, I am Harry Lausanesiris, and this is my YouTube channel, grecochess. And now we are going to focus on the fourth and last round of the IM Danny Kopec Memorial Swiss chess tournament that took place yesterday night, June 13th, at Floral Park. First, we're going to share with you the wonderful church that hosted the event. It is in Schooner Street in Floral Park. You see here the main entrance. The chess tournament took place at the basement, and there is a side entrance to the left where a pointy arrow, not clearly seen. Next, we're going to show once again the announcement. You see here the four rounds, May 23rd, round number 1, where I lost, May 30th, where I won, June 6th, where I lost, and yesterday night, June 13th. So I have 1 point out of 3, which means that no matter how well I do, I have basically no chances to get any of the prizes. But of course, I was still going to participate and do my very best. You see, the time control is G90 D5, which means that when the game starts, each player has 90 minutes, 1.5 hours on the clock. When it's their turn to play, the clock for the first 5 seconds does not move, and then it goes downhill, and players need to complete all their moves before the clock goes down to 0. And of course, when it's your opponent's turn to play, in case you wonder, no, your clock does not move. It only moves for the player whose turn is to move, and only after the first 5 seconds. Few words now about my opponent on round number 4. It is Philip Mathew. His current rating is 1350, and he's in the 78.8 percentile. Compare this with mine. It's 1554, and I'm the 85.8 percentile. This means that my numbers are better than his, and in theory I'm the favorite, but of course everything depends on what happens on the chessboard. Philip had white, and we're going to follow the moves one by one. We're going to see here on the right, what does the computer quote unquote think, meaning how it evaluates the positions. Plus means computer thinks white is better, minus means computer thinks black is better. And which, if the move is the best, or otherwise what the computer thinks should have been the best move for both players. And Philip starts with a minor surprise. Knight goes from g1 to f3. I call it surprise because usually you start moving your pawns. Most of the times in the D and the E pawns, occasionally the C, the so-called English opening, once in a while the B on the G if you want a fianchetto, but sometimes, although not very frequently, the knight from G1 to F3, and this is called the ready opening. I reply with my D pawn. Why the D, not the E? Because the E would have been taken. Now move number 2, he pushes the E pawn to E4. And you may be wondering, why does he give me the pawn for free? The computer thinks a mistake. But I think, or at least I thought then, that this is what they call a gambit, meaning you sacrifice material for development. And I was almost certain that if I had grabbed the pawn, and especially if I had insisted to keep the extra pawn, he had a very strong attack prepared in advance. First of all, I must take the pawn, otherwise I lose my pawn, and I have to use my queen to get out, and who knows what, but temporarily at least, let's get the pawn. And of course, he's going to save his knight to g5 and attack the pawn. I defend the pawn with my knight to f6. My main goal was not to defend the pawn, but to develop a piece. By my pushing my knight, I did both. The computer would rather have me push the bishop, but they say knight before bishop. And of course, during the game, we had no access to computer evaluation. He pushes the other knight to c3, both develops the knight and attacks again the pawn. I let him get his pawn back, develop my knight to c6. He moves his bishop to c4, and now I need to be careful because my pawn at f7 is threatened. And it's not just the pawn, but it's a pawn near my king. And if he takes, for example, with his knight, he forks my queen and my rook. So I'd better be very careful. And to stop any such ideas, I move my pawn from e7 to e6. He takes back the pawn. and now develop my bishop to e7. Why did I choose this move? Because I wanted, if he took my knight, to take it back with the bishop and not the queen. I didn't want my queen to be exposed so early and be near the center. He moves his d pawn to d3, both controls his knight at e4, and also opens the diagonal for his dark color bishop. I castle. Short side, of course, and he castles, of course, king side, as they call it, or short castling. I move my pawn to a6. Why? Because I don't want his knight to end up in b5, and if in the future his bishop goes to f4, to have a very powerful attack against my f4 pawn. Yes, I can still push my pawn from e6 to e5, but who knows if this will compromise my position otherwise. So you try to stop any ideas as early as possible. He moves his bishop to e3, he develops it, controls the square d4, and I move my rook to e8. I don't want to be the first one to exchange the knights. Here, the two knights you see, e4 and f6, are ready to be exchanged, but there's a saying to take is a mistake, so I want, if the exchange happens, I want him to initiate it, and not me. And yes, Philip initiates exchange with his knight, taking my knight. I take back the bishop. And now I'm happy to see that my bishop of f6 controls what's called the long diagonal from a1 to h8. If you look at the board, there are two long diagonals from a1 to h8 and from h1 to a8. And ideally, you want your bishops to control them. He moves his rook to b1. In that time, I put into practice a plan I had taught even before, and explain why I did it now, not before. What I wanted to do is I wanted to win the two bishop advantage, and I could do it by moving my knight from 6 to a5, because his bishop can only be saved at b3, and no matter where he does it, I'm going to take his bishop by giving my knight, and both I gave the two bishops and I double his pawns. But if I did it while his rook was as a1, then I would give him the open a file that he might exploit, but now I can do it without having to worry about it. Of course, he can still book back his rook at a1, but he has wasted two tempos putting his rook back and forth. Yes, he'll put back his bishop on b3. I take it. He takes back with a pawn. And now if he wants to take the a file, he needs to move again his rook. I move my bishop to d7. Develop my bishop. That's the only square I can place it. He moves his knight to e4, near the center. And I don't want to lose my bishop. I want to keep my two bishop advantage, go back to e7. And by doing so, I make sure that his knight, yes, it has a nice place at e4, but cannot go to any square forward. c5, d6, f6, g5, he goes there, he loses a piece. He pushes his pawn to c4, better control of d5, and gains a little bit more space, but the pawns at b3 and d3 become backward, meaning they cannot be protected by neighboring pawns. For the time being, this is not so important because I cannot grab them, but this is what's called a long-term weakness, meaning yes, now I cannot exploit it, but I could in the future, and perhaps you could avoid it by having to create other weaknesses elsewhere. Don't give unnecessary weaknesses. And so what they do instead, my bishop goes to c6, my light color bishop, and they control now the other long diagonal from h1 to a8. He moves his knight to g3. Maybe he doesn't like the exchange, but I wasn't too much afraid. If this happened, we might exchange queens and rooks. I would try my best to control the d file. But I'm trying now. I see that the route to the pawn d3 is open. I attack it once, defend it once. What if I put a second attacker? So queen goes to d7, hoping to put one of my rooks at d8 and attack it. what he does not avoid such a scenario, he pushes his pawn from d3 to d4. Until this point, I have an advantage is around half a pawn, something like that. And still it is at the same area. But at this time, I really started being afraid because his knight at g3 can go to h5. What would happen if the knight went to h5 and the queen to g4? He would threaten with checkmate on g7, and if I try to defend by putting my bishop back to f8, then he has what's called the royal fork, and I lose my queen. So at this time, I started being worried and thinking how to stop any such ideas as early as possible. And now I can push my pawn at g6 and stop the h5 idea. But if I wait one more move and his queen is here, I can push all I want the pawn to g6, but due to the pin, he can still put his knight at h5. And that is why to stop these ideas as early as possible, I do something that otherwise would be weak. In fact, it is a weakness. I'm creating a weakness in front of my king. But if you have an immediate danger, you might have to create long-term weaknesses to postpone the danger and hope you'll not pay for that weakness. The pawn from g7 to g6 weakens my king. Yes, I'm aware of it the moment I did it. He give him access to dark-colored squares next to my king. My king is not so safe, but I thought it would be less unsafe than if I allowed the knight to end at h5. The computer would like me to move my pawn to a5, but I didn't even consider that move. I was mostly scared about his knight landing on h5. Instead, his bishop lands on a6. I expected it. And I have to say that they're now even more scared because now he can bring his queen at g4 and he has 3 pieces against my king. Not enough defense. And he could even give me the choice to either get his knight or his bishop, but with the queen in the other piece, create havoc. Because if he puts a queen here, and his knight goes to h5, I take his bishop somehow, then his knight goes to f6, fork, grabs my queen. If I take now the knight, the queen checks, and it could end up in a checkmate. And I was really started feeling nervous at that point. The computer may say it's a mistake, but I had no access to the computer, and based on general principles and whatever I calculated, I was feeling really very nervous. How to defend? Bishop goes to f6, at least I gain control of the g7 square. Until now, you see that the decision is the following. First of all, I grab control of the g7 square, which was my number 1 priority. But in addition, I'm attacking now the pawn at d4. If I was allowed it, I would take it with my queen, because the moment that the queens are exchanged, not only have an extra pawn, but the danger evaporates. And Philip saw that, and to avoid losing the pawn, he pushes to d5. But the computer thinks it's a blunder. Myself, I only thought that he played the second, the lesser evil out of losing the pawn at d4, better lose at d5. The computer gives me now an enormous advantage, more than 2.5 pawns for the first time in the game, move number 19. I take it back with my pawn, not only get the extra pawn, but also open the file for the rook, the e file. His queen goes to f3 and attacks my bishop, which means that in addition to worrying about a potential checkmate in the immediate term, I would think of how to save my bishop at f6. Computer thinks the best thing to do is put my queen at e6, but then the bishop would depend on the queen's location, and I wanted to send it to g7 because I wanted to exchange it with his bishop. And in spite of the rule to take is a mistake, I would be the first one to exchange it if possible, because I want his queen, knight, and bishop 3 pieces attacking my king to stop attacking my king. I have the extra pawn, but if I have 3 of his pieces against one of my pieces attacking the extra 2 pieces, he has a very good chance to destroy me. And I was very relieved when, instead of waiting for me to take his bishop as I was planning, or I was expecting his bishop to go to g5 or something like that, he's the first one to take my bishop. Computer thinks the best move, but I felt a relief. I take it back to my king, and I only have to worry about queen and knight instead of queen, knight, and bishop. Still, I have to be careful, but I thought it was less dangerous than before. His knight cannot go to f5 because my queen will dead it. He can go to h5 and create havoc. Not now, perhaps. Even now, the queen could check, but if in the future this queen could go in the g file, maybe. Instead, he checks from c3. I have many ways to save my king. I have to be careful not to put it somewhere where the knight can do a check or the queen can move, because if my queen goes, for example, to f8, his queen goes to h8 and checks. If it goes to g8, then perhaps his knight could go to h5, going for checkmate to take it back, and I open the line for his queen. Currently, his queen doesn't have support, but who knows later. So I had to be very careful how to answer the check, and I decided that instead of moving the king, better push the pawn to c4. I threatened his queen, so in addition to anything else, I win a tempo. He has to think where to put his queen before continuing the attack. He moves it to d3. Now I open the diagonal from this bishop. This is another nice thing. My bishop from c6 before it was blocked by the d5 pawn. Now it can go all the way to g2. And I move my rook to d8. Why? To provide extra support for my pawn at d4. I have an extra pawn. Why not keep it as much as I can? And he moves his rook to d1 to attack the pawn once again, attacks it twice, defended twice, cannot get it now, but if his knight goes to e2, I would have to be very careful. And while technically my pawn is not backwards because of the c7 pawn, there is this bishop at c6 that would have to leave for my pawn to go to c5. So my pawn at d4 is in a very sensitive, if not precarious position. I decide to defend it by putting my queen on g4. Now, not only I continue defending, I'm twice attacked, twice defended, but there's another danger for Philip, because if his knight on g3 would magically disappear, for example, if it went to e2 to grab the pawn, I have immediate checkmate, the bishop at c6 and the queen at g4. If I had a few free moves, the pawn from h7 go to h5, h4, and either I would take the knight or I would checkmate. Philip realizes it, and he wants to force my queen to go away, so he pushes his pawn from h7, from h2 to h3. Of course, not the f pawn, because then I would grab his knight. I still want to threaten checkmate, so queen goes to g5. The problem being now is that the pawn at d4 is not so well protected. It's attacked twice, defended once, but still he not get it, because, in fact, he'll get it, but he's going to sacrifice queen for rook. If his queen takes it, I take it back to the rook, and he takes my rook, but when all is said and done, he got the rook and the pawn, and he lost the queen. That's why I'm not so scared about this pawn. He's going to move his rook from f1 to e1, and if I allow the exchange to take place, meaning if I allow him to take the rook and I take it back with the rook, then my pawn is lost. I may take it back with the bishop, but I don't want my bishop to lose this wonderful diagonal and stop the threat, mating threat, and that is why for the second time in the game, I violate the principle to take is a mistake, and I initialize the exchange. Why? Not because I want exchange and to make my life easier, like sometimes beginners may do, but because there is a specific reason behind it. So I take the rook, he takes it back. And now I start the attack. Pawn from h7 goes to h5. If I get one more move, as you understand, what is going to happen is that if he keeps the knight here, he loses it. If he moves it, there's a checkmate on g2. And now there is one move that can save him if he puts his knight to e4 because he blocks the diagonal. Now I have to think of putting my rook on e8 and how else to continue attacking. And Philip is thinking for quite some long time because he can see the danger, how to respond to that. And while I was considering his knight going to e4, he decides to defend by moving his rook from e1 to f1. You see, my advantage becomes larger all the time. From about 2.5 pawns, it's almost 3.5 pawns. And I push my pawn from h5 to h4. Easy to find the best move because now he really needs to think what to do. If he moves his knight anywhere other than e4, it's immediate checkmate. He leaves it here, he loses the knight. He puts it on e4, I attack it once with my bishop, he defends one with the queen. I would put my rook on e8, and I wasn't sure if that was strong enough. He could back his rook on e1 or push the pawn to f3. I was thinking of all these possibilities. And of course, Philip was thinking of all these possibilities, what moves can save him. And finally, he ended up with a move that I was hoping he would do, because in addition to thinking how to reply with his strongest move, putting the knight on e4, I was thinking how to exploit if he did anything else. And he pushes the pawn from f2 to f4. That's not just a mistake, it's a blunder. You see now that my advantage has increased to more than 6 pawns. Exactly what I was hoping for, because now I win his knight for free. Yes, his knight was protected by the queen, but my pawn will take back the queen, and now not only have the piece and the pawn more than him, but in addition, if queens are exchanged, things are simplified. Philip tried to avoid the exchange of the queens by moving his queen to d2, but he cannot because I check from e3. Now he must take back the... Well, he can put it in f2, but still would exchange queens. Instead, he takes my queen. I take his queen. And he puts his rook of f1 to attack my pawn on e3 and stop it because too near promotion. I let him take it because I move my rook to d2. As I was expecting, he gets the pawn at e3. And I take his pawn on g2 with a check. And my calculations were as follows. No matter what he does, I'm going to take the pawn at b2. I'm going to continue threatening more and more of his pawns and grab his pawns one by one. And once I have enough pawns, I'll push one of them to promotion. Basically, that's what's happened little by little. I started gaining more and more of his pawns. At some point, in addition to anything else, I made sure that his rook was... quote unquote imprisoned, meaning my bishop and my pawn would not allow his rook to move. Yes, he had the rook on the board, but the rook could not move anywhere. And then I started pushing my a pawn very near promotion. And just as I had an enormous advantage, finally Philip Mathew resigned. Philip, once again, congratulations for the game and for playing as well as you did. In fact, you scared me quite a few times. Just a few mistakes here and there decided the result. Hence, at this point, I'm going to ask chess.com computer to do the review of the game. You're going to see my accuracy was 89.4% versus 79.4% of Philip Mathew. I played as if my rating is 2400. Once again, that chess.com computer is too generous when it gives the ELOs. For Philip, it was 1900s. None of us had a brilliant move. I had the great best moves, 12 versus 11. For me, excellent 5 each of us. Our first moves were book moves. Philip had 5 inaccuracies versus 4 of mine, 2 mistakes each of us. I had a miss, and I believe the blunder of Philip was when he moved his pawn from d4 to d5. This concludes the fourth round, and let's see now the final scores of the tournament. We are going now to share the screen with the final scores. You're going to see them here. Credit goes to the Chief Tournament Director, Lila Furman, and also yesterday at the beginning, just before the games, she sang the national anthem of the United States. That was a very touching moment. The technical director, Jay Kleiman, that took care of all the details, Chief Assistant Technical Director. There were 3 winners. Jay Bonin, he couldn't make it yesterday. He got a bye. Brian Lawson, who had defeated me in round number 1, and Vincent Yu with 3.5 out of 4. And myself was position number 19 with 2 points. My rating after the Cheshanti tournament had been raised to 1562. Now it goes down a little bit to 1560. This concludes a coverage of the Danny Kopec Memorial Tournament. We'll have more videos in the future. Thanks for watching. Thanks to all of the subscribers. See you sometime in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Harilaos Aniziris, the Greco Chess YouTube channel. Goodbye.